Hello, everyone. We're here today to interview Dr. Mike Austin from the History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies Department at EKU. And we're going to be talking about war and peace and just war and individual responsibility in terms of engaging in war or supporting war. So a broad topic and something that I think is very often missing in the average citizen's view on war. So hopefully these perspectives will give you a broader consideration of some of the basic issues that humankind has dealt with and fought over for years and years and years. When is war just? When should we support it? What are the standards by which judging whether war is worth its costs? Those kinds of issues, and where does the individual stand as a citizen, particularly as a military active service member in the issue of war and peace. Dr. Mike Austin, welcome, and we'll start with asking you how a philosopher would approach the broad issue of war.
Broadly speaking, you can reach as far back as at least Plato's Republic. Right? There's a discussion of when it's morally justified to go to war, and also like actions in war. So there's a section in the Republic where they talk about how you should treat the dead bodies of your enemies, right? So this honor ethic kind of thing. But in philosophy, and it kind of overlaps with religious thought as well, but there are really two main schools of thought, I would say, about war. And one you mentioned is just war theory, which really is present in ancient philosophy, but I would say most people trace back to Augustine, the Christian theologian and philosopher, kind of the first real formal statement of it. And then, so that's one category. And the question there is it ever morally justified to fight a war? And if it is, what are some of the requirements or criteria that need to be met? And then, of course, why ask that question? Well, just think about the negative impact of war, death, destruction. And as we've, over the centuries, learned more about the impact on soldiers and their families, and of course the natural environment, culture. I mean, it's just so destructive in so many ways. And so you want, if something has those negative impact, those negative consequences, it's got to be you need to have a moral reason to do it. So philosophers, not all, but the vast majority would say war has to have a moral justification. It can't just be national interests, right? Because then it's just basically a free-for-all. And so we want to try to limit that. The other major school of thought is pacifism. And so, again, there's a variety of thoughts there, but basically it's the answer is war is never morally justified, right? Because of all the negative things. And so there's always a non-violent solution, or at least we should work towards that. So big categories. And I would say just war theory, the discussion really took off again. Like, of course, it happened a lot during the Vietnam War. And then really in the late 70s until about 1990, 91, you didn't hear much about it. But with the first Gulf War, there's just this explosion of literature again in philosophy. So books, journal articles, all those kind of things. And so there's been a lot of thought about that in recent years. And with new technology, right? So like issue of drone warfare, nanotechnology is potential issues. So yeah, anyway, big picture stuff.
Do you think that our educational system and even our churches address these issues very well, or can we learn more as we are raised in the society about the right questions to ask, the things to consider in terms of whether I support this candidate and his or her plan to go to war, continue a war?
Yeah.
How's education fared in preparing us for these?
Yeah, it doesn't seem very well, at least through secondary education. So I was trying to think back when these issues were discussed when I was in high school. I remember an English professor who was in Vietnam. He was able to be in like a quartermaster's office. But he would talk about it some literature, but there wasn't not like a robust discussion of just like a framework. So whether or not you believe war is just war theory is true, at least gives you an initial framework to start thinking about the questions. And I just don't think we do do that. We tend to think kind of two extremes, a knee-jerk reaction, well, my country right or wrong sort of approach, and then the other sort of hypercritical approach of war is never justified. Maybe that's true, but we don't wade through the heart issues. I don't think we've learned to ask those hard questions as a society, usually, not in K through 12. And then you see it more, I think, in higher ed because of, in philosophy, it's one of the major questions about ethics and warfare. I think you see it in literature, well, actually across the disciplines, it becomes more of an important, or not more important, but more of a question that's addressed in the classroom.
I personally struggled with the kind of the political culture I was raised in, which was a military culture, and the things that I was taught to believe about war and why we had to go to war and who we had to go to war against and so on. And my religious tradition, which actually, at least my introduction to my religious tradition really emphasized peace and personal responsibility for making the right political choices in terms of voting, as well as personal responsibility should you find yourself in that. And for me, those were almost two completely different standards or reference points. And so my conflict personally in Vietnam was trying to reconcile those two. And as I mentioned earlier to you, my father was a 3-war veteran. Encouraged me as I departed for Vietnam to trust my faith and what I was taught about my faith over what I was taught in his political culture that I was raised in the military, as well as the larger national political culture. So I really struggled with that, and I feel fortunate that I was able to discuss some of these issues in a religious class in my junior and senior year. But I found very few other people kind of prepared to even think about these conflicts, perhaps, or these inconsistencies between what we're taught and what we are kind of taught religiously.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what I'm about to say, I'm going to say as somebody who, like, faith is important to me, but I think broadly speaking in America, the American church, just Christianity, Protestant Catholic, just the whole thing, in many ways, and it's more true in some traditions than others, is in some ways it's an anti-intellectual. There's a thread that runs through. So sometimes people are afraid to ask questions, like difficult questions about their faith or about things like war and peace. And so in many ways, it depends on the church and the tradition, the theology. Oftentimes it just seems like whatever our politicians decide, the church kind of baptizes it, so to speak. Then I've been in the past year or so reading a bit more from like the Anabaptist tradition and Mennonites, or the peace churches, and there's peace movements within a lot of denominations. And so some really grounded in, their theology, their understanding of the Bible, their traditions, but really good, sort of a more prophetic approach, and like in the Old Testament way, right? The critical, the calling to a higher moral or spiritual kind of behavior. And I think that's difficult, right? Because of like your dad's advice, well, that's not an easy place to be. You're in the military, you're in combat, and somebody says something that goes against your conscience or your faith. Now you've got a difficult decision. Yes, right. In many ways, difficult. Yes. So I think the church, just like the education system, could do a lot better. Just gave an avenue or gave a context for people to ask the questions. And so people of faith can, how does my faith relate to this? Because it does, and not just automatically put a rubber stamp on it. And I think that's they're hard questions, which maybe that's partially why we avoid them, because we don't want to wade in. And I know we've mentioned this a little bit already, the individual responsibility part. I might have some answers that might scare us or we might not like. And maybe it won't, but just ahead of time, it makes it difficult, I think, to wade in.
Yes. And I wouldn't indict a whole church or a whole religious tradition. My experiences came down to, in my case, individual priests. Some ignored the issue and others took it on. And so I consider myself fortunate to have had a priest leading a religious class that felt like it was an important thing to look at and to discuss. What do those traditions say to the individual in terms of their own responsibility? Can we say my country right or wrong and maintain, our kind of religious standards? Can we ignore something and say, I don't know enough about it to make a judgment, so I'll let them decide these things? What is the average person, religious person, to do with their own struggle with whether I should support this or not?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, you might have. Some people are just going to, from sort of peace church tradition or pacifist traditions, just as a matter of conscience, always be against the violence of war. Others almost always accept it, I think, sort of a rubber stamp approach, but on an individual basis, and it's difficult because there are things we can't know. We don't have access to the information at the highest level of decisions, but we still have to live our lives as best we can according to our conscience. Right? And so if they're weighty decisions, they're life and death decisions, not just potentially like our lives, but lives that we might take, how our lives and the lives of those we care about will be impacted. So I think, like in any moral decision, we're relying on other people for information because we're human, so we can't know everything. But given what we know, we have to do our best to make choices informed by our conscience that we're comfortable with. Now, there are going to be times where that may not, I don't want to say not be possible, but it can be really difficult. We're not going to be perfect. And so I come at it as somebody, like my dad was in the Marines, and a lot of family members that were in the military. I never served in the military. So I'm pro-military in a certain sense. So I guess I'm torn, right? Because I see all the good that's been done. The life that I have, due in large part to people that served to make that life possible. But then I see the negative impact on the soldiers, see the way that maybe the military has been misused over the years by our government and others. So I think some wars we've fought have been just, some haven't, according to just war theory. So it's that, but as an individual, ultimately, maybe this is more my philosophical approach, I have a community conception of ethics, right? We're part of a community, whether it's a religious community, American community, the local community. But along with that, we're responsible for our choices. And there's a point where there's no easy choice. You just make the best one that you can, and then you live with the consequences, positive and negative.
Yeah, I suspect the the political status of churches and the status of their finances and their autonomy and so forth has something to do with how these issues are presented within the church or not. I also feel that we educate people to believe that you are limited in your ability to understand certain things, and there are experts who know all the details. I mean, I've heard this over many, many decades. We know things you don't know, and so you're going to have to trust us when we say we must do this, this, and that. And I come back to the very fundamental issue that we are citizens and we offer up our sons and daughters to this, to the military, and I have that to bring to the decision. You may know more about weaponry and strategies and tactics, but I know what it's like to lose a child or to risk my child's life. And so I have something to say in this discussion. And it's as important as how many tanks we produce or what the next strategy is. And I just wonder how the average person is able to contribute to these decisions based on the human and the ecological and many other costs associated with war.
Yeah, that's a good and hard question, but I think because of what the government in these kind of cases is asking of the average citizen, just as you described it, then it's fair and maybe even incumbent upon us to push back in the sense of, well, you need to like justify this, right? It's not like a small price to pay. It's not like an inconvenience, right? It's like things with the pandemic in the past year, those are inconveniences mostly. It's not an inconvenience to go put your life on the line on a battlefield or send your son or daughter off to war. So we have to, over the years, I think we've seen incredible good things done by the government. We've seen breaches of trust. So just trust me isn't enough when the stakes are so high. And there are things, of course, there are going to be national security things that we don't have access to, and sometimes for good reason. But just this is can't just go on sort of blind faith, and so we have to force them to make the case. That's that's government by the people, right? There's ideally they serve us, and so we want to call them to account to do that. And that's not easy because, especially these days, you'd think it would be easier, just much more access to social media and online kind of stuff to communicate. But I think in some ways we're still fragmented. So we can complain about something online, but there has to be organizations, community groups, veteran associations, those kind of things that can then give a unified voice where you can't. They can ignore me, right?
Right.
So they're not going to ignore thousands of veterans who are for some accountability.
We in the intro class we play a tape by a Navy SEAL who at age 53 had to retire for medical reasons and entered Yale 2 years ago as a freshman. And when they asked him what he hopes to accomplish in college, because he's retired, he doesn't need a degree, frankly, he said two things. One, I want to become a better human being. And that's the reason I'm going to study humanities. I thought it was very interesting. He said, second, I want to be able to speak truth to the power. And he clearly was suggesting that we're wasting a lot of lives in a lot of needless ways with no payoff at the end. And he realizes that his voice will be far more powerful than an academic voice or a regular citizen. And I play that tape to myself over and over again to remind myself of those two things, to become a better human being. And I ask the classes to think about their education in terms of that goal, as opposed to achieving a degree and a GPA and those sort of tangible things, but to look at education as an opportunity to become a better human being. So I think that's a fascinating perspective by a very, very war-weary SEAL who was involved in all the major battles in the Middle East over many years and many, many times. I see two, in terms of whether a war is just or not, I see kind of two levels. One is the war itself, the cause, the reasons for going to war, and the payoff of having conducted a war. Are those acceptable? Are they moral? Are they just? Are they legal? Also, then within that war, whether it's just or unjust, and I consider Vietnam to be unjust, but with the conduct of the war, and I also thought that was unjust in terms of almost a free license to kill people, and very few consequences if you chose to take target practice on a farmer from a helicopter just for the heck of it.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think certainly the war can be just and the conduct of it could be unjust. And, that's a very difficult thing to kind of sort out. But I guess I'm not sure what my question is, other than maybe what is the responsibility of someone who is in service to resist a tactic or a larger strategy, but a tactic is what usually individuals deal with, that allows, in a sense, free license to murder.
Yeah. So you think about like just war theory in general, that division is how the tradition often looks at it, both the decision to go to war, is that just, and then how you carry it out. And so the decision to go to war is the most fundamental, is it being fought for a just cause. And usually the clearest example of that is a war of self-defense, right? And then closely related, although this opens up the door to abuse, I suppose, for manipulation, but defense of a vulnerable other nation that's been attacked by a third party. Is it conducted by or declared conducted by legitimate authority? The other last part is a last resort, right? If you try to exhaust other solutions. But then you turn to the conduct in the work. And a proportional use of force is one of the criteria. So basically, it's just using only as much force as necessary to achieve the goal. And then the one that you mentioned with the helicopter, the farmers, can be described different ways, but essentially it's discriminating between combatants and non-combatants, right? So someone who's even that line can be hazy, but someone who's a combatant, an enemy soldier, in the sense that they're morally justified as a target within war, but the civilian, the farmer, is not. And of course, there can be mistakes, collateral damage, so, to use the sort of the terminology that's been used, but it's doing your best to avoid harming innocent civilians. And so clearly from the tradition, just target practice on a farmer would be wrong. It'd be violating just war theory. And you're individually responsible for that. And anybody above you who's either advocating it or ignoring it, they have responsibility too. My own view is that the higher up you go when these things happen, the more responsibility there is. Because the 18, 20-year-old, I think when I was that age, I was actually a senior in college during the first Iraq War in the Gulf and worried about being drafted. I think I probably would have gone at the time, but you have all that pressure of the authority structure on you, and so I'm not saying that absolves you from responsibility, but people who exercise that kind of power and control and authority over the lives of hundreds of thousands of young men and women have greater responsibility. So navigating those things incredibly difficult, but yeah, from a moral perspective, we have to do our best to try to do that and be willing to go against the grain in certain situations if that's what ethics requires.